Welcome back to the class. And in today's class, and today you must be knowing that today is the penultimate class. We will have the concluding class tomorrow. That means the last class of this course tomorrow, where I will be giving a very broad overview as well as some concluding remarks. So before that, I thought it would be useful to have at least one session dedicated to understand the relationship between theoretical perspectives and methodology. This class is specifically within the framework of sociology, but what the content of the class, or the message of the class, or the prime point that I'm going to emphasize is applicable to every discipline, applicable to every subjects. The kind of a connect between theory, methodology and method is something that I'm going to talk about in this class, and that is something extremely important for every discipline, not only that of sociology. So theoretical traditions and methodologies. So in the previous three classes, we looked at three important theoretical traditions: functionalism, conflict theory and interactionism, and we also had some very brief mentions about the later theoretical developments from the post-structural, post-modern theoretical tradition. So at present we will not be able to talk about the current 3 or 4 important theoretical traditions, because there are so many, there are numerous theoretical traditions. But what is important is to understand the kind of a very direct connect between a particular theoretical orientation and its corresponding methodology, because methodology does not stand in isolation, and every theoretical orientation has a methodological it has a methodological orientation in itself, and there must be a congruence between the kind of methodology that you use and the kind of theoretical orientation or theoretical perspective that you adopt while you conduct research. So let us begin with this fundamental question. Sociology as the study of society and the question of how to study the society, okay, and more importantly, what is to be studied. And now once you study sociology, once you begin to carry out research, you may not have time to look at these fundamental questions. You might think that, okay, you have a well-defined problem at hand, and there is a issue, you have a field, you have say you need to collect data from 100 people or 200 people, or you have to do interview from some 50 people, that constitutes your data. But before reaching into these conclusions, it is extremely important that you really ask, or at least you be very be familiar with much deeper philosophically informed debates about these questions: how to study the society, and more importantly, what is to be studied, okay, and what is the society, what is that you want to study, and how do you make an assumption that what you want to study is directly connected with the data that you are going to collect. You have a particular research question in your mind, and you think that there are certain social phenomena that reflect these research questions. That is a kind of an assumption. But you have to be extremely careful when you jump into such kind of conclusion, thinking that there is a direct empirical phenomena that really reflects the kind of research questions that you have in mind. Because these questions, what is to be studied, okay, and how do you capture the reality, what constitutes social reality, this question is a deeply philosophical question, a question that has been discussed and debated, and there have been numerous discussions and debates about this simple question: what constitutes social reality, and how do we capture that? Okay, is it already there? Is it independent of our senses, or is it that we create an image of an ordered social reality out there? Okay, so how do we believe our senses? Okay, do we have any other way of understanding this particular reality without the help of the senses? There are serious, those who are familiar with philosophy would realize that these are some of the very, very fundamental questions. So these questions, at least I'm just introducing you to some of the philosophical debates, because this is not the time to go deeper into these questions, but those who are going for higher studies in sociology those who want to have a deeper understanding about society must be familiar with at least with these broad concerns, so that they have better idea about the complexity of this whole enterprise called as social research. Why I'm repeating it is that because many a times we hardly give a we hardly give a thought about why we are approaching or why we are adopting a particular method. We think that it automatically comes, and many times we don't really pay adequate attention to establish a congruence between a theoretical perspective that we adopt, a theoretical framework that we adopt, and its corresponding methodology. Because there has to be some kind of a consonance, there has to be some kind of a congruence between the methodology that you adopt, the method that you adopt, and the kind of theoretical questions that you ask, or the kind of framework where you place your study in. And if they are completely, there is absolutely no if it's full of mismatch, then that raises serious issues. So this relationship between ontology, epistemology, methodology, and research methods. So I want to invite your attention to these 2-3 terms. We must have come across epistemology and methodology in the previous classes, but this ontology, epistemology, methodology, and research methods, there is a kind of a connect between each of these terms, each of these processes, or each of these aspects, and it is extremely important that we need to understand that. And if you look into the trajectory of sociology as a discipline, how did sociology emerge? We know that you are familiar to that story by now. Sociology emerged as social physics. Sociology wanted to ape modern sciences like physics. It wanted to do study in a scientific manner. Okay, but later that kind of a positivist orientation was challenged later. And as we saw in interactionism, the phenomenological approach came to the fore. Okay, they don't want to be called as scientists. They argue that sociology or society cannot be studied through scientific method, or there is no need to study it scientifically, because scientific method will not reveal a lot of stuff. So sociology, if you look into the trajectory, the historical trajectory of this discipline, it has had so many detours, so many different directions. It's debates about methodology and epistemology. It developed into so many different directions, and it's extremely important that a student of the discipline becomes aware of these transformations. Now, what is ontology? Ontology is usually used in philosophy. Ontology is the study of existence. Okay, it's the question of being, what is there. Okay, it's the question of the whole issue concerned about the thing out there. Ontology is also the study of how we determine if things exist or not. Okay, it's the question about reality as well as the classification of existence. It attempts to take things that are abstract and establish that they are in fact real. Okay, so how do we understand the whole question of, for example, when you say that there is reality or there is violence, for example. Okay, how do we categorize violence? What constitutes violence? What constitutes an act of violence? It's not a simple question. Okay, what constitutes an act of violence? Does violence always need to be a particular act that that kills somebody, or that maims somebody, or the person is incapacitated? What constitutes violence? And this is an ontological question, because if you look at some of the interesting discussions and debates on violence, scholars talk about different types of violence. Scholars talk about symbolic violence, for example. Scholars talk about social violence, for example. They talk about cultural violence, for example. So what constitutes violence? You want to study you want to conduct a research on violence on certain group of people. So how do you study violence? Usually you know that a particular community has been targeted, and then you need to go and then see how many people are stabbed, how many people are murdered, how many people are wounded, and that constitutes the violence for you. But for philosophers, for social scientists, in order to understand what constitutes violence, how do we make sense of that, is a question that related to ontology. So ontology is the philosophical study of being. More broadly, it studies concepts that are directly related to being. In particular, becoming, existence, reality, as well as the basic categories of being and their relations. The questions of reality. How do we capture that? How do we understand this question of reality? And there are very deeper philosophical debates about the question of being. Is it a real? Is there a reality, objective reality out there? Okay, irrespective of, in spite of our experience and irrespective of our thinking and other thing. So there are questions whether is there a reality out there? Okay, in spite of our existence, in spite of our senses, is there a reality out there? Can we think of a reality in our absence? Is it possible, or is it a kind of a mental construct that we create some kind of an order for a completely disorder kind of a phenomenon out there? And the very fact that we can, or we are able to experience a reality only through our senses, what is the implication of that? And how do we communicate with each other the kind of reality that we construct through our senses? And these are some of the very extremely important and complicated philosophical questions. Okay, because we know that whether is it the social world or the physical world, it is so chaotic. It is completely without any order. It is completely confusing. It is completely arbitrary. But are we making some order out of that arbitrariness, or are we imputing certain kind of order for that chaotic society, that kind of a chaotic situation? Okay, so these questions, there's no consensus among philosophers among that, but these are some of the initial thinking about the study of any object for that matter, whether it is physical object or social object or whatever be that. Okay, so here as well, we sociology, especially philosophy of social sciences, it begins with this kind of a question: what is the kind of a reality that you want to study? What is that you want to study? The questions of being, its categories, its labels that we attribute to that. How do we look into that? Second important concept is epistemology. Epistemology is the philosophical study of the nature, origin, and limits of human knowledge. Okay, so if ontology is the question about the reality, if it is about the question of what is it, okay, what is its existence. Now on epistemology is the whole question about human knowledge, what kind of human knowledge we use to make sense of that. So it studies the nature of knowledge, epistemic justifications, the rationality of belief, and various related issues. So it tries to understand how do we construct certain kind of knowledge forms, how do we say prioritize our certain kind of understanding as the authentic knowledge over others, and how do we say that this form of particular knowledge is greater than or better than the other kind of knowledge? How do we make sense of that? How do we interpret the kind of a reality in a particular way? How do we say that scientific rationality is better than say a kind of a knowledge that you derive from magic, or knowledge that you derive from religion, or knowledge that you derive from black magic? How do you say that? Okay, so epistemology is also about the construction of concepts, the nature of conditions, and the validity of the senses. How do we distinguish truth from falsehood? What are the kind of technology, what are the kind of techniques that we use in order to distinguish between falsehood and truth? How do we say that, when we say that something is truth, what does it mean? What does it mean for a theologian? What does it mean for a scientist when he or she says that it's a truth? What does it mean for a scientist? What does it mean for a theologian? What does it mean for a priest? Or when somebody says that it's a beautiful scenario, it's a beautiful truth, what does it mean? Okay, so what constitutes social reality? What is the data for social inquiry? How do we segregate data and collect it? Because these questions, these epistemological arguments or epistemological positions will tell you what constitutes that reality, and how do we collect data for that, and on what standpoint do we stand, what theoretical framework do we stand, and then assert that, okay, this is the data for me. This is how I understand this is how I understand the social reality, and this is what constitutes, this is what if I'm coming from such and such epistemological foundation, such and such epistemological basis, and this epistemology offers me this explanation to understand reality as so. So there could be competing epistemological basis, but you understand, for example, from a feminist epistemology, you will take a completely different position about a household situation, okay, a very happy home, for that matter, an ordinary family, okay. And if you take a feminist epistemology, you would try to problematize that particular happy home into a very problematic arrangement of sexual of gender roles. Okay, so how do you conceive of certain things? How do we use the human knowledge in order to make sense of a social reality in a particular manner? Okay, so that is something the epistemology talks about. And third one is research methodology. Okay, it is the theoretically informed. It's a theoretically informed, systematic way of conceiving and implementing research protocol and procedures. When you write a research proposal, okay, you usually have to have a section on research methodology. So what does it mean? Research methodology is not something that you talk about the method. There's a difference between research methods and research methodology. Research methodology is a science of doing research. It's a complete conceptual scheme. It's a kind of a complete conceptual scheme that explains why you adopt a particular research method. What is your theoretical understanding about the data? How do you conceive of social reality in a particular manner? What are its theoretical and philosophical justifications? Okay? If you are adopting interview, okay? If you are, for example, you need to understand violence, okay? You want to understand domestic violence, and you are using a feminist framework, and you want to conduct an interview. Okay? You want to conduct an interview. You want to conduct a unstructured interview. Okay, so in an unstructured interview, you don't go to the person with a set of questions. You make it as kind of open-ended questions. You encourage the person to speak, and you only try to guide the conversation into certain thing. So you need to really explain why that you adopt an unstructured interview to understand the situation of a domestic violence, especially from the perspective of a woman, a victim of domestic violence. And so you will explain that I would listen to that person, I would encourage, I would let her recount the experience. Okay, so this experience that person recounts, it could be a slap on the face of that woman must have experienced. But how she felt about it, how she felt about it, was it only the kind of a physical pain that really hurt her, or how did it really provided? How did it really? How did she feel it? How does she explain or experience the kind of pain and shame emerging out of such a situation? Okay, and this is what you understand as violence, and this particular unstructured interview, this kind of a narration, this kind of a explanation of this victim would constitute your data, and for that you require a particular method. So it goes to, so there is a very specific connection between research method, methodology, epistemology and ontology. So it is the theoretically informed, systematic way of conceiving and implementing research protocols and procedures. Once you do higher forms of research for your doctoral studies or other thing, you know that there are very specific protocols, starting with your identification of your field, identification of sample, your respondents, your data collection techniques, your data analysis tools, and other kind of interpretation that you adopt. So all these things are important, and it must start with the question of reality and knowledge to capture this. Okay, so fourth one is the research method, which I think more or less all of you are familiar with. And when you talk about research methods, we talk about the specific tools and techniques used to collect specific forms of data as defined by methodology informed by deeper understanding of epistemology and ontology. And so every social science research is intricately connected with the question of ontology and epistemology. But in reality, in our everyday practice, we hardly think about it. We think that we assume that these are much more simpler terms and simpler procedures. So we straight away we go into the field and collect data and then come back and then say that this is the scientific research procedure. But if you dig deeper into that, if you think deeper into that, these questions are much more complicated. Now, research methodology in sociology. So whatever I explained so far, this is true in the case of natural sciences and physical sciences and social sciences, whether it is in economics or physics or psychology. It is applicable to every form of human discipline, not only about sciences, any discipline that wants to conduct research, whether even if you are doing a study on philosophy. Okay, but now let us spend some time trying to understand the kind of a specific implication of these things in research methodology in sociology. So evolution of research methodologies in sociology since its inception. I don't think I need to summarize it again. We have mentioned it several times. Sociology emerged as social physics as a science, as a positive science, and then with the coming of Weber, you have this anti-positivist stand emerging, and then with the coming of interactionist, it takes a completely phenomenological turn. It does not believe in facts or things. It tries to understand how meaning is produced among different people. So it has a very long trajectory, starting with positivist, anti-positivist or phenomenological approaches, and a host of perspectives that emerged later. Okay, I don't have the time to go through all these things because that does not come under the purview of this course. And also, more important is an influx of ideological as well as political positions in deciding theoretical as well as methodological frameworks. Okay, so it is not that there are only academic debates and concerns about what is the most appropriate theoretical or methodological framework. A host of ideological as well as political positions have come, and then they have made the realm of sociology extremely complicated. Not only sociology, but almost every social sciences extremely complicated. For example, with the emergence of Orientalism, okay, with the emergence of Orientalism, a completely different set of political concerns and ideological concerns were brought into picture. With Marxist scholarship, Marxist scholarship has its own ideological and then political position. Feminist scholarship has its own scholarship. Dalit perspective, Dalit studies, Dalit argument has its own one. Gender studies has its own ideological as well as political positions. Okay, so a host of other host of other disciplines and arguments have really made it much more messy. So now nobody vouches by the character of its objectivity of the study. I don't think any any social scientist, any scholar of contemporary time would say that what we are putting forward is the most authentic study, the most objective study, or this is the truth. Nobody would say that. We know that all such claims are quite problematic. Okay, so there were critique of positivist positions, impossibility of finding out the objective truth, because now we have established it beyond doubt that there is no singular truth. Okay, even to an incident that has happened just maybe yesterday or day before yesterday, it's almost impossible for you to reach what is the objective truth. This is a very problematic truth, the unadulterated complete truth. It's a very difficult proposition. What at best we can able to is the most reliable interpretation of that. There are arguments that there is no truth but only interpretations, and especially in this world we are living in the era of post-truth scenario, an extremely dangerous scenario. We say that we are living in the post-truth era or post-truth stage. So, but even otherwise, to say that this is the objective reality becomes a very problematic argument. Okay, so no social scientist, no scholar would say that. It would only try to present the most convincing argument on the basis of available evidences. So you have a host of research methods, and I am sure that you are familiar with quite a few. When you talk about survey, there is something called as a census. Census is another type of method where you enumerate every member of a particular research universe. Okay, for example, you are conducting a survey among school children of a particular school, and if you are asking each and every child about your research question, maybe about the classroom experience, about the attitude of the teachers, and if you are counting every child, then the survey becomes a census. We know that the decennial census that we undertake every once in 10 years. Otherwise, it's a survey. Survey is that you go by the idea of the probability. You take a sample, and there are statistically proven method. What does it mean to be a representative sample? So you, instead of asking everybody, you take a small section of people on the assumption that these people represent the larger universe. Then there is something called as a questionnaire, a printed set of questions. Either you hand it over to the people to fill it, or you must have come across it in Google form, Google online surveys and other things. Or if you are conducting this survey among people, you ask these questions, and then you yourself you fill it. And mostly it includes the kind of a quantitative questions. And then interview schedules. Interview schedules are a set of series of questions that are arranged in a particular order, so that there is a kind of a thematic continuity, and then you ask, and then you record the response. Then there are focus group interviews. You have a particular theme, and you ask several of the respondents about that particular theme. For example, you have some 5 or 6 housewives, and then you conduct a focus group interview on domestic violence. Okay, so you record the response from all of them, and their discussions and their cross information. All these things becomes extremely important insights. Then participant observation, a very important participant observation and ethnography considered to be together. A very powerful, very useful tool of anthropology and sociology, where the researcher lives in the community or with the community and try to become a part of the community, observe the dynamics very closely. Okay, a method started with anthropology but still continues to be extremely powerful, because here you are not worried about numbers, you don't do statistical analysis, rather you come up with very insightful, very detailed analysis about the social processes. Then content analysis. Most of the literary studies students use that, historians use that, sociologists use that. You try to understand what is the content of a particular text or a song or a story or an interview or a published stuff. And discourse analysis, another important method that is connected with content analysis. You try to understand your material as two distinct discourses or as a single discourse, and then you try to understand how that discourse is formed, what are the underlying assumptions behind that discourse. And then network analysis, both digital as well as physical. What are the kind of the character of network, what are the kind of relationship that people are involved in, and especially in this digital era, network analysis is assuming very important place. And then ethnography and so on. Ethnography is the term used to do ethnographic work in the digital world. How do you, because these digital resources are very powerful, useful resources. Your Facebook account, your Twitter account, the blogs, the videos, interviews. So you sociologists or every social scientist have used very effective methods to make use of this enormous amount of news, that an enormous amount of information that is available in the digital world. So now, why and how each of these methods is used is of paramount importance. So that is the point I am emphasizing again and again. And why should you use say interview schedule instead of ethnography? Or why should you use a questionnaire instead of a network analysis? And these, if you were to answer these questions, you need to understand the kind of a connection that I mentioned earlier, from ontology to epistemology to methodology to method. Otherwise, it becomes a very mechanical one. Otherwise, if somebody asks you what is your understanding of reality? Why do you use this particular method to capture this? What is your epistemological understanding? That you will not have any kind of particular answer, convincing answer for that. So then along with these methods, the more recent advancement, maybe after 80s, there is postcolonial studies, then there is influence of Michel Foucault and Edward Said's Orientalism. These are all important ideological movements which actually provided also very interesting methodological take on that. And the kind of a connection, the kind of relation between power and knowledge. Both Foucault and Gramsci and Edward Said speak about that, the intricate connection between knowledge and power. No knowledge is free from free of its power, and how the power in a positive sense creates knowledge, or how knowledge is very closely connected with power, or how certain kind of knowledge produce certain kind of subjectivities and certain kind of people. And debates on positionality and standpoint theory. Again, this is extremely important when you talk about this question of objectivity, the whole question of representation. Who can represent whom? Okay, when you look at the story of a Dalit, okay, who can tell the story of a Dalit in a most convincing manner? Okay. Can an upper caste person represent the Dalit experience? There are very fascinating discussions and debates about this experience and this positionality, even in the Indian context. The debate in which philosophers Sundar Sarukkai and this political scientist Gopal Guru involved, and it came out as a book titled The Cracked Mirror. This book is a very fascinating account on this whole kind of questions. What does participation mean? What does experience mean? When you say that you have an experience, what does it mean? So does it mean that others who do not share your experience cannot, talk about it, cannot write about it? They are all very, very fraught questions. So similarly, feminist epistemology, racial theories, Dalit arguments, and so on. So each of these arguments make this realm of methodology more and more complicated, at the same time more and more fascinating. That is why we understand that the studying a society is not that simple. Studying a society is not as simple as somebody doing a research work in the laboratory. It's a much more fraught, complicated domain. It's a much more messy world, where a host of ideological, political factors have made it much more messy, much more complicated. So that's why we realize that by conducting research, you are not going to tell the truth, because what the truth, in that sense, it's a problematic one. But at the same time, we also must know that this is not a license for pushing or peddling half-baked truths or utter lies or other things, because that's also what we are witnessing today. Okay, but the important aspect is that students or scholars must be really well trained in the methodology. They must be able to use very rigorous methodological protocols. They must be they must be able to use very rigorous methodological protocols and practices. So this rigor of methodology, that itself will really ensure the kind of quality and reliability of the kind of research that that people do. Okay, so I'm winding up the class today, and tomorrow we will have the final class of the entire course. We'll have the concluding session, but today I just thought that I will spend some time trying to make some observations about conducting or doing social science research. Okay, so thank you.